Hello and welcome to VMware Evolve Online. This session is securing and protecting your Office 365 data with VMware Workspace ONE. My name is Adarsh Kasari and I'm a solutions architect here at VMware in the End User Computing Business Unit. And with me, I've got Camilla Lotero, who's a senior solutions engineer. And we've actually done a couple of iterations of this session over a number of years. We started at probably 2018 at VMworld, and we've done various different iterations and done it since then. And this is going to be a really shortened, condensed version, but I highly encourage you to go watch our session at VMworld that we did in 2020, because it actually goes through a lot more detail. It goes through a lot of the demonstrations that we want to show around Office 365 security and protecting that Office 365 data. And so we're going to get straight into this session. We want to try and get as much content in as possible, but please, there's plenty of great VMworld content out there. So please go to vmworld.com. Shameless plug, please go look up our session. It's got phenomenal reviews so far, and we'd really like to make sure that that content gets across to you and you can see those fantastic demos that we may not cover in this particular session at this moment. So just in terms of an agenda, what we want to go through is a couple of core things. Firstly is the concept of the security principles around Office 365. And we think about this more from an endpoint. What is the Office 365 data that's on an endpoint, and how do we go about building a security paradigm around it? And then we go through three core areas, and we'll identify the controls and technologies that you have in device management, in application management, and identity and access management, that together as a holistic set of solutions delivered to you via Workspace ONE allows you to go in and create that security framework for your Office 365 data across your various different device platforms. And then we'll finish this off with some of the other security tools that are out there. There's plenty of them for Office 365. There's plenty of ways to secure your Office 365 data, and plenty of integrations from a VMware Workspace ONE perspective into existing investments that you have in your organization. So we'll start with the security principles. And I almost think this is one that we don't have to always iterate out to people and explain what is Office 365 security and what does it entail, but it's often a really good starting point to identify what are the potential threats and the potential vectors that you may have to consider when you think about delivering Office 365 data to an end user. And so when I think about what Office 365 data is available on a mobile device, the first thing I think about up front is a mobile device is not just an iPhone or an Android device. I'm talking iPads, I'm talking Windows devices, I'm talking macOS devices, I'm talking devices that are potentially kiosks that you don't own, that you still allow a user to potentially have access to Office 365 data via a web browser or via a native client. So I think about devices more broadly across all of the different device platforms out there in the ecosystem. In terms of the data, that's any sort of document or artifact that sits in any sort of Microsoft Office 365 repository. So things like OneDrive, things like SharePoint, other approved repositories that are made available through your Office 365 applications. Those are all within scope of that particular data that you want to make sure is secured and contained. You also want to worry about things that are in your email. So things that are delivered via the Outlook email client, for example, on your various different platforms, but then also some of your other more native or more mobile-centric mail clients. VMware Boxer being a good example here, the native mail client on iOS, or any third-party mail application that you may get from the App Store. The key thing around all of this documentation, all of this these documents and these files and these emails is they are synced locally to the device. I mean, yes, it all resides in the cloud and you're downloading it down to the device, but there is a footprint of that particular data that sits on the device that you need to consider your security principles around it. And then what that really means from an IT standpoint is you need to have a strong IT governance around that work data to ensure, firstly, it's secure, B, you've defined how people are going to go in and access that data, and C, what actions and remediations are you going to take if potentially a user or a device or a combination of doesn't meet those security principles that you've set up front. So To go through just the core principles, I want to make a couple of assumptions up front. Firstly, everything that we're going to talk about in this session relates to the native Office 365 applications. So the Word, the Excel, the PowerPoint, the OneDrive, everything that you get natively from Microsoft that are made by Microsoft Corp, those are the apps that we want to consider here. We're going to demonstrate a couple of things. Again, they're not specifically in this, but you'll see a couple of screenshots that show how we've done some of our configuration for the Outlook and the OneDrive applications. But please go to the VMworld session, you'll watch all the videos, and you'll actually see every single bit of the demonstration flow that we do on the way through. Probably the most important point of this is if I am a user with malicious intent and I want to go in and steal Office 365 data, no matter what security setup that you have, I will find a way to circumvent it, right? So malicious attempts will always be out there and they will never truly be negated. The aim of this exercise, however, is to stop the accidental data leakage. It's the ability to stop someone doing a regular business workflow or a regular day-to-day process that accidentally leaks that data out to a place that they really shouldn't. And in order to achieve that, there are three core areas we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on device management and setting a minimum operating system security requirement on the device. And we're going to go through different device types for this. Application management, and this varies. This depends, within the Office 365 apps themselves. Can you set your DLP policies to ensure the data doesn't get shared out to other applications in there? And then last but certainly not least is identity management. And this brings in the whole world of zero trust as well. And it's not only do I validate someone's coming in from a trusted identity, but under what conditions am I going to allow that user access to that application? Or potentially do I prompt them for additional strength in their auth? Do I potentially remove functions from them as well, depending upon their device posture and their identity posture? So these are the principles that we're going to talk about for the remainder of this session. And so what Workspace ONE does for Office 365 management is a holistic management of all three. If you take device management, application management, and identity and access management and blend them all together, that in a nutshell is what Workspace ONE is doing for Office 365 management. We have a suite of technologies within the stack that allows you to go in and target each of those different areas to make sure that your Office 365 environment is secure, and then give you a framework that allows you to integrate into third parties and other solutions from Microsoft, as well as third-party vendors, to help enhance the strength of your Office 365 environment. So we're going to go focus on device management here. And so device management, this has been around for a while. Camilo and I both were old school AirWatch. We've been around for quite a while in this space doing iOS and Android management. And if you think about all of that, they all came around this idea of containerization. It came around this concept of, hey, I have a device that potentially has personal applications and corporate applications. And the whole idea of mobile device management at the time, now enterprise mobility management, is the ability to separate between work and personal apps. So personal Facebook and corporate Office 365 don't mix. You can't take data from one to the other. So I can prevent that data flow between work and personal apps and allow IT to just manage those work applications and the data associated to it. So I can set all of my controls around my Office applications from a device level and say that's a managed application, and as a result, I can't share that into something that is an unmanaged application on a mobile device. And you'll see that this has grown beyond just iOS and Android, where this has been quite easy, into other platforms as well. For example, we'll start with some basics. The first thing we set from a device management perspective is setting things like a passcode requirement. On mobile platforms, iOS especially and Android, passcodes enforce encryption. So if you've got a passcode on your device, you're enforcing device level encryption, which allows you to have a level of device security that you need before you start layering your Office applications on top. And you can go in and configure these policies however you want. Most typical deployments we see, they actually go in and configure things like a corporate issued certificate to those devices as well. So it says if I'm going to try and access an Office 365 resource, well, I need to come in from a managed device. And the way I'm going to go and get a managed device is I've got to go put it through Workspace ONE, and my Workspace ONE administrator has defined that I get a corporate issued certificate that is unique to my user or unique to me and my device that allows me to to have that cert to guarantee a level of trust. And that's available across every different device platform. And you can use that certificate for many different things that you need to as well. To continue on the same path of other device level controls that we have out there, device level restrictions are prominent across all of the different device platforms. All you need to do is start creating profiles in the Workspace ONE console to see there are iOS restrictions, there are Android restrictions, there are Mac OS and Windows restrictions out there that turn on and off different functions. And based upon your requirements, your user base, and the security posture of your organization, you may choose to turn off some of these features. So you can see there's an iOS one, there's an Android one. The policy set will slightly change between the two based upon the functionality that are made available by the OS manufacturers. And this is what I mentioned earlier, which is setting the app to be MDM managed if it's user installed. So what we're saying is if the device goes under management and a user's downloaded one of the Office applications, let's say prior to the device coming under management, you can actually take ownership of that application and say, well, now that app is going to potentially have company data in it. As a result, it needs to sit in the corporate context of the device, which means it's got management, which allows it to be, you can only share within other managed apps, which also means if that user does leave the organization, an administrator could run an enterprise wipe command and it would remove all of the company data out of that application as well from that device. If I'm going to go dig into a specific platform, and Windows 10 is a really big one, especially from a Workspace ONE strategy perspective, but really around a DLP story, it's one that's sort of growing out quite a bit. The first thing we do, just like you would do on iOS where you set up a passcode, you would enable BitLocker encryption via Workspace ONE, and you would go in and escrow the recovery key in the console and also use the various different hardware level integrations in. So things like integrate that into using the TPM as part of your BitLocker encryption profile. So then you can go in and you can set your different BitLocker authentication methods as well. So if you need to do an encrypted PIN, if you need to do the TPM as your auth method, you can go in and enable that and set your core device level principles around that. This one's a really interesting one, and it's around data protection, and it's one that's sort of come from the iOS world, translated into Windows, and it's the idea of saying, can I go define the Office applications on Windows as managed applications, and therefore the data associated to it is tagged as managed data. So what that means is not only is the app managed, all of the content from the Office applications is encrypted. It comes up as a company ownership type on there based upon some of the settings that you apply in the console. And it also affects how you can share that data out. So you may be in a position where you set the policies that don't allow that user to share that particular data to someone else. And then just to continue on the same trend here with the Windows 10 features, it's all about trying to get a baseline level of policy and a security posture of the device. So setting things like your Windows firewall policies to ensure, and your AV policies to ensure that you've got your device at a minimal acceptable level before you start layering your Office 365 applications on top here. So all of these policies for iOS, for Android, and you'll see in a moment, I've got Mac OS ones much the same way around security and privacy and encryption. All of these policies are enabled in the Workspace ONE console to allow you to build a device management platform that is a universal standard across all of your device fleet that then gives you that level of confidence that you have the device controls ready to go in and apply the remainder of your Office 365 application and identity controls to then create those different layers of data protection around this. So it's incredibly important. Most of you who have been familiar with AirWatch in the old days, a lot of this looks very familiar because some of these principles haven't really changed. We use the same principles that we would use on the device management side if it was an Office 365 as well. So if this was Salesforce, if this was another core line of business application, all of these principles hold true for the device management piece because it gives you a nice baseline across all of your device fleet to ensure that your applications can be delivered securely. So the next topic that we're going to go through is around application management. And I'm going to hand this over and the rest of this presentation to Camilla.
Hey, thank you, Darj. Appreciate it. Yeah, so one of the key components when it comes to securing Office 365 data that's being downloaded to an end user's device comes down to securing the application itself. So as Darsh just mentioned, one of the key things is making sure that the ecosystem of the device where that application is being installed is secured. There's no malware. It has the right profiles and security measures. But we also need to take into account what's happening within the application itself. There's a lot of times where a lot of the measures that are being implemented by MDM may or may not be enough to properly or to the right degree be able to secure the data that's being downloaded to those applications, whether it be through the functionality, the functions that you can take through each one of those applications. And this is also especially important in scenarios where MDM might not even be an option. So scenarios where BYOD and end users using personal devices to enroll and download the corporate data, or MDM might not be in scope to secure those devices. That's where having a strong set of security measures within the application container itself would create could create a sufficient enough solution to allow those end user devices to still access some of that corporate data. So nowadays, a lot of different productivity applications have started to inject or make available a lot of different DLP and security functionality or features within their own application SDK. And this is especially true for Office 365 applications. So Office 365 applications, their entire suite sort of shares the same set of DLP settings that's available throughout the SDK, that's available throughout all of the main Office 365 applications. Now, the enforcement and configuration of a lot of these settings does happen through Azure or the Office 365 cloud. But one of the key things here is that in order for Workspace ONE to provide a holistic approach to securing both MDM managed and BYOD devices that are downloading Office 365 apps, we're able to integrate directly with Azure and with Office 365 to be able to create and enforce those settings directly from within the Workspace ONE console. So with this in mind, the flow to enroll a device, whether it be MDM managed device or a BYD device that's just downloading these applications through the Workspace ONE Intelligent Hub, the process to enforce and set up those settings for the specific users and devices is pretty simple. From an end user's perspective, all they really need to do is enroll their device in through the Workspace ONE solution. Again, either as a managed device or as a registered end user registered device in a BYD scenario. Workspace ONE will reach out to the Azure cloud and set up the appropriate settings, the appropriate DLP features within the Office 365 applications, and have Office 365 and Azure cloud enforce those settings whenever the end user tries to access any other corporate resources. So we can take a look at some of the different settings that are available to be configured through the console. And there's essentially two main sets of features that we can take a look at. One is what happens to the data, or how can we secure the data when it has been downloaded to the device itself. So we can take a look at the things such as DLP functionality and restrict that data from being shared to non-managed parts of a personal device, for example. So not allowing the data to be downloaded, safe locally, share with non-secured applications that are not part of the corporate ecosystem. Or even being able to just do a screen capture or a copy paste of any information that's being relayed to within that application itself. But there's a second set of features, and that has to do more with creating a local authentication framework within that application itself. So again, as Adarsh mentioned, we can create a high degree of authentication requirements for a specific corporate device when it is MDM managed and you have control of the entire device. But when it comes down to possibly a personal device where MDM is not the administrator of the device, then the possibilities of creating or enforcing a passcode on the entire device might not be there. So that's where creating a strong enough password policy to secure and encrypt the data within that specific application or Office 365 application becomes critical. So in most cases, you can create a high enough degree of password complexity to match the password or the passcode or the password complexity that's being enforced across the entire corporation. But one thing to note is that because it is a local passcode that's being enforced, it would be separate from any domain credentials. It would just be a separate passcode that the end users would have to remember. Now, so that was mentioned, one of the other key components when it comes to securing access to corporate resources, specifically Office 365, has to do with identity and access management. So one of the key things with Office 365 and Azure is the ability to be able to federate the authentication or delegate that authentication and authorization of those resources to a third-party identity provider. So in this case, we're primarily talking about Workspace ONE as an identity provider solution. Though in a lot of cases, we've worked with customers that already have a third-party solution and are able to integrate that authentication flow with Workspace ONE as sort of that back-end authentication mechanism. But essentially what it comes down to is how are we able to authenticate a device, a request to access those resources, and what are some of the factors that we're taking into account when allowing or denying access to those specific resources. So one of the things that we try to do with this approach is to move beyond just looking at the specific identity and role of the specific user that's accessing those resources. And even though it is very critical to provide a degree of authentication that's high enough to properly validate who that specific user is. So whether it be through a simple domain credentials or strong authentication via certificate or MFA or multi-factor authentication. We also want to take a look at parameters or feature or parameters that are being given by the specific device that's trying to access those resources to inject that as part of the decision making as whether that specific request should be given access or not to those resources. And then it comes to things such as mainly information that is being gathered by Workspace ONE as an MDN solution. So things such as, is that device encrypted? Is there a strong enough passcode on the device? And just things as making sure that there's no malware installed on the device or anything that could compromise the data before even giving access or authorizing that authentication request for any of that data to be downloaded in the first place. So when you insert Workspace ONE in line as part of the authentication process for Office 365, again, we can validate who the end user is that's trying to access those resources, but we can also do a real-time sort of validation that the specific device that's trying to access that the specific managed device that's trying to access those resources is in a compliance state that's secure enough to be able to secure that data locally, whether that data is being downloaded or just being streamed to that specific device. So we can see an example of how those policies would take a look and would look like from the Workspace ONE Access Console. So in this case, we're taking a look at an iOS device. And what we can do here is we can implement an authentication method that we call mobile single sign-on. And what essentially mobile single sign-on allows us to do is to provide a strong authentication method via essentially a certificate backend authentication method to any of the native or non-native third-party applications that are installed on an iOS device. So with that, we can omit the need for the end users to manually enter any credentials, but we can also inject any device information, or we can inject the device-specific identifier into the authentication process. So we gain context about which device it is that's trying to authenticate. And with that, we can actually check, is this device properly secured? And is it compliant according to the different policies that have been set up by the company administrator? Now, we do have a lot of flexibility with the authentication process. Again, if we're dealing with a BYOD scenario where a device might not be managed and things such as certificate authentication or mobile SSO may or may not be available, you do have the ability to fall back to what we consider as still not as secure, but still secure enough authentication process, which is the more default sort of approach of domain credentials plus a second factor of MFA solution, such as a push notification. Now, when we take a look at the second example, we can take a look at a Windows 10 approach, which follows a very similar framework of authentication process. In this case, instead of doing mobile single sign-on, we've replaced that with certificate. So through Workspace ONE, the Workspace ONE management of the device, we can handle the full lifecycle management of the certificate, make sure that the certificate is being requested from a valid and trusted CA authority, inject that into the device certificate certificate store, and present that at the time of authenticating any of the Office 365 resources. And again, if we're talking about a BYOD scenario of a Windows 10 device, optionally, you can fall back to quote unquote a less secure authentication method in the form of domain credentials and an MFA solution. So with that, as Lars mentioned, there are other tools that allow you to secure Office 365 solutions. So we won't go into great depth within this presentation, but we still think it's appropriate enough to at least mention them to make sure that people are aware of them. So one of the key things that we see a lot of customers use is the use of a cloud access security broker, or almost usually refers to as a CASB. So essentially a CASB, it allows you to do an inline or out-of-line DLP traffic check to any data that's being transmitted from a client device to an Office 365 resource. So making sure that no documents are leaving the corporate ecosystem of the device, and even do a more in-depth check of the type of documents or data that's being transmitted to the personal device. So being able to restrict PII information, HIPAA compliant information to be transmitted to any personal device or non-compliant device that may compromise that data. Another important solution is the Azure Information Protection. So we've talked about setting compliance settings at the device level, at the application level, and with Azure Information Protection, you're able to create a lot of the same settings at the sort of document and file level. So making sure that you're identifying confidential information or confidential documents, and making sure that you're setting the right level of security for that specific document that's being transmitted. So making sure that that specific document is encrypted to the level that only the appropriate receiver is able to decrypt and view that information from a managed or authorized device. And finally, we have third-party solutions that specialize in mobile threat prevention. So again, as part of being able to secure an endpoint device is just making sure that there's no malware installed and actively running on those devices that could potentially not only compromise the end user's credentials, but compromise data and leak it outside of the corporate domain. So with that, just to provide a really quick recap of some of the three main assets or three main points that are being used to secure Office 365 data and applications on devices. The first thing that we talked about, or Darsh mentioned, is device management, right? Making sure that any of the devices that are downloading and making use or manipulating data from Office 365 corporate domain are properly managed, have the right set of credentials, have the right set of enforcement of credentials type, and profiles that would secure the device at a degree high enough to make sure that all of that data is being secured. We also talked about application management, right? In cases where some of the device policies may or may not cover DLP policies at a level high enough, or in cases where MDM management may not be available, for example, in a BYOD scenario, having local enforcement of DLP functionality within those specific applications would provide, in a lot of cases, a sufficient solution to give access to that corporate information in BYOD or non-MDM managed devices. And finally, we talked about identity and access management. So owning the authentication process of Office 365 corporate Office 365 resources to be able to identify not only the end user or the identity of the user that's attempting to access those resources, but also the specific device that's being used to access those resources, and using the device state, device attestation, the device compliance status at the time of making a decision to either allow or deny access to those specific corporate resources. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and it gives you a quick glimpse as to some of the different solutions, approaches that you can use to secure Office 365 with Workspace ONE. As Adarsh mentioned, we've done a different variants of this presentation throughout the years in VMworld. A lot more extended versions of the presentations that includes live demonstrations and video demonstrations of all the different components that we discussed today. So we do encourage you to look us up in the different VMware catalogs for the different years. And again, we hope you enjoyed this presentation. And that's the end.